So picking up on our themes of story and partnership, we have someone from the Public Good Project, who are massive and amazing storytellers, and they have partners with Kaiser Permanente and the Dell Foundation, and I want to invite to the stage our next speaker, who will help talk to you about what you can learn about story, what they've done with story, John Hoffman. John, thank you.
Good afternoon. I think that what I'm going to talk about, which is the future health of this country and the chronic disease burden that we face in this country, is an interesting follow-up to what we just heard, which is about how we are allocating resources in this country for different disease burdens. And my history as a filmmaker and as a media executive goes pretty far back in tackling some of the health challenges that we face as a nation. And I began my work at HBO quite a while ago, but about 10 years ago, I was asked to tackle addiction. And in a partnership with the National Institutes of Health and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we launched Addiction in 2007 to try to help families with loved ones who are struggling with addiction to understand that this is a chronic relapsing brain disease for which we have some effective treatments, and people need to understand that this is not a moral failing. So this was a major initiative viewed by about 25 million people. I followed that by doing the Alzheimer's Project. Maria Shriver was the executive producer of that, and this was a co-presentation again with the NIH, and involved with that, with the Alzheimer's Project, was the Alzheimer's Association, Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund, and Jeffrey Bean Gives Back. And this expanded and as these projects were developing, so were the abilities to really use new media technologies to disseminate this content much further. And I think that this really all came together with the weight of the nation. And I'm very proud that we were able to create sort of an unprecedented coalition of the NIH, the CDC, and the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences, as co-presenters of the weight of the nation, which was to address this terrible disease burden that is coming as a result of this obesity crisis that we have in this nation. And as was just mentioned, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation and Kaiser Permanente were the partners in the weight of the nation. And that's how I met Zeev. And I want to point out that Zeev invited KP to present the weight of the nation at his Social Innovation Summit in New York a year and a half ago, and I also was asked to speak about it. And I just really want to give a shout out to Zeev and his ability to bring people together, his identification of people who are trying to solve problems and enable them to make connections. And that's why I'm here at his invitation to speak about what I'm doing now to try to address this terrible disease burden that I keep talking about in this country. And I want to just give you some sense of how unhealthy we are as a nation. So 25 million Americans have type 2 diabetes, but 79 million more have prediabetes. And if they do not control this situation, many of them will move on to develop type 2 diabetes. I think it's about half of these people who do not know that they are at risk for diabetes. 67 million Americans have high blood pressure, and more than 2/3 of adults are overweight or obese. So this is creating an unprecedented situation for our healthcare system. It's not only that this much disease, which is silent in our bodies. Part of the problem is that we are not aware, we don't feel high blood pressure, we don't feel high blood sugar, we don't feel high cholesterol. For too many people, the first sign of high blood pressure is a stroke. For too many people, the first sign of high blood sugar is turning over into frank diabetes. So this was one of the most sobering lessons that I learned in my immersion into public health in making the weight of the nation. So this is, the CDC has determined that children born today will likely have a shorter lifespan than their parents. And I ask you all, how can we let that happen? I mean, is this really this part of this great bargain that we have made in the society with all the advances and all the advantages we have, are we going to let our children have shorter lifespans than ourselves? Part of what's compounding this problem is the cost of healthcare. No matter what we think about healthcare reform and everything that's going on right now, there's not an economist who would argue that the cost of treating this amount of preventable disease is sustainable. Every economic model points to this. We had a meeting. I went down to Fort Worth to meet with a man named Matt Rose, who is the president and CEO of Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroads, which is part of Berkshire Hathaway. We had interviewed him in The Way to the Nation, and he spoke very eloquently about the cost of healthcare to corporations. And so we arrived at his office. We sat down. He said, you know, I'm on the board of AT&T, and AT&T is now a healthcare corporation. And I was with a group of other people and some corporate leaders, and everyone looked at him and puzzled. And he said, oh, yeah, the largest cost to AT&T of doing business is its healthcare. And that's when, right now in the United States, our healthcare is 18% of GDP. That is double what the next closest nation, which is Britain, which is 9% of GDP. He says, what will happen to AT&T when healthcare costs are 20% of GDP, or 22, or 25? Will they have reason to stay in business if really all they're doing is paying for healthcare? GM spends more on healthcare than they do on steel. So this statistic, which is that 5 out of 10 adults in America have difficulty understanding and using health information. This comes from an IOM, Institute of Medicine report. Health and Human Services estimates that 90% of Americans are functionally health illiterate. That means that people do not have the ability, to understand the instructions that their doctor give them. They do not have an adequate understanding of how to read a pill bottle. If they were asked to read an article in USA Today about type 2 diabetes and what it means to be at risk, they don't have a functional ability to really understand and process that information. So I started thinking that this unacknowledged finding of Health and Human Services, the same agency that is charged with rolling out our healthcare system and managing healthcare reform, managing Medicaid and Medicare, has a finding that 90% of Americans are health illiterate. This is a recipe for disaster if the healthcare costs, healthcare savings that are to come from preventing chronic disease are what is going to enable our healthcare system to survive. We have to prevent the disease rather than to treat it. So if 90% of Americans are functionally health illiterate, I think this is a very big problem. So I set out, I was an executive at HBO still at that time, and I started talking with the leaders of the NIH, the CDC, Francis Collins, Tom Frieden, Harvey Feinberg, the head of the Institute of Medicine, and I said, we have to use the media to raise the health literacy of the nation. If we're going to succeed as a nation in getting healthcare under control, if we are going to be a healthier nation, we've got to raise the health literacy of the nation. And I have been tasked with taking on some of the nation's most complex health problems, communicating them to the public in ways that hopefully they'll understand. And let's use the momentum that we have. Let's use the relationships that we've forged for the greater good. So I left HBO, and with their great support, they are my landlord. They are helping to get something called the Public Good Projects off the ground. And in a partnership with the Institute of Medicine, we're setting out to do just that, to raise the health literacy of the nation. I'm going to play a video now, which will give you a sense of the size and scope of what we're attempting.
The nation is not healthy.
We are seeing chronic diseases growing.
If you go with the flow in America today, you will end up overweight or obese, as 2/3 of Americans do.
We're investing an enormous amount of money in trying to mitigate the chronic disease state.
We know that obesity has profound implications on diabetes, on high blood pressure, on many of the risk factors for heart disease.
I'm on actually 13 different medications.
I've had high blood pressure since I was 11 years old.
I may not be here as long as I would like to be.
All of us have to be part of the solution to reduce obesity in this country. Otherwise, we're going to be faced with steadily increasing healthcare costs and the lives that are lost from cancer, heart disease, diabetes.
We've engineered physical activity out of our everyday lives.
Roughly 1 in 4 adults gets no physical activity at all.
We send messages on computers and emails. We don't even walk to the next office to speak to somebody.
Screen time has just skyrocketed. People have multiple screens in their lives, in addition to the television.
A child born in 2000 has a 1 in 3 lifetime chance of having diabetes.
This is probably going to be the first generation of children who are going to have a shorter life expectancy than their parents.
Do you want your children and your grandchildren to inherit a society where their hopes for a long and healthy life are not even as good as yours were?
This is preventable. This is not one of those unfortunate acts of nature that we just have to accept as reality. This is not the product of a tsunami.
So with A Healthy America, we're trying to create a cultural revolution in this country. We're trying to say that accepting this amount of chronic disease, accepting that people are going to lead shorter, sicker lives, that there will be much more suffering in this world than already exists in our own country, that is unacceptable. That on our watch, we are going to see this reversal, I keep talking about it, this reversal in life expectancy in the history of the world, the history of mankind, other than due to famine and war, we've never reversed life expectancy. So I just see this as just morally unacceptable. And I'm making the simple argument that we need to use the media. Every sector has to be involved. I think that you all can understand that we have to build healthier communities, and many people have spoken about that here. We have to have a healthcare system that is much more conducive to preventing health rather than treating it, preventing disease rather than treating it. And I'm saying, what role can media play? But if we're going to have a cultural revolution, it's going to require a mighty, mighty coalition. This is where I have thanks to Zeev for this invitation, that it will require, and this is where the Institute of Medicine is playing an organizational role, their power to convene. We are trying to create a coalition of unprecedented size with, I got 1 minute? Join us in this coalition. Make A Healthy America happen. I'd love to talk to any and all of you about what is being done, what is being planned. But we really are trying to drive cultural change. We know this will take decades, if not generations, to accomplish, and I hope you can join us in it. Thank you.